Hello, family, and welcome back to the Explore the Extraordinary podcast. My name is Betty, and today I'm joined by Mark. I just asked Mark what kind of title he would like me to say, and he was like, "Just call me Mark." But Mark's been a doctor for a long time, and he's done a bunch of workshops for IANDS online platform, and he's got so much information. We've had an opportunity to have some conversations with each other, and just this vast amount of spiritual knowledge. We're going to try to fit it into this teeny little space of this podcast episode, but I'm really excited for your willingness to come and serve the community at IANDS once again. And I'm going to toss it right over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Betty. And as we said beforehand, kudos, bravo to you for your turnaround, because it exemplifies what is possible. If you could do it, anybody can do it. And so it gives so much hope and inspiration. Thank you. I'm 70 years old, so I mean, this body is 70 years old. My real self is timeless. So there's a lot to cover. But in a nutshell, when I was 6 years old, my parents showed me a beautiful sunset, and I told them it reminded me of God. And yeah, I get teared up just thinking about it. And they only told me that about 17 years later when I was in theology school. Because they were perplexed. We were brought up in the Lutheran faith, and it was always God the Father this and God the Father that. And so they had no idea how I would equate a beautiful sunset with the creator and sustainer of all life. So that suggested that I retain some memory of from whence I came. And indeed, throughout my life, I felt like a stranger in a strange land. I kind of had to learn earthly ways to fit in, and I quickly slipped into meditative states before I even knew what that was. My family were pretty much average earthlings, and that's excuse me, and that's not a criticism. It's just 85%, according to Michael Newton, people on Earth right now are more beginner souls. So they'd be watching sitcoms, which drove me crazy, the canned laughter and all. And so I go into another room and read, and then I thought, oh, I'd like to stretch. And years later, I discovered those were yoga stretches. So I've been told by a number of psychics and mediums and people who can see energy and so on in my life between lives reading that I'm a more evolved soul. I don't say that, with, ego. It's just, it's the way it is. It's different people have different energy. And a teaching soul who comes in, some call it a blueprinter, to help an area have a breakthrough when it's time, when they're closed. And I just kind of go around the cosmos doing that. So that sounds like a cool job. I'm told that I travel with an army of angels and guides and master teachers. I mean, sometimes I'll walk around, the psych will go, "Oh my God, you brought them all," so I'm thankful for that. When people give me kudos, I say, I'm just a mouthpiece. I think I asked my team, I said, okay, here's what we're going to do, whether it's writing a book or putting together a course, or help me know what to say, how to say it, when to say it, please. And then it just flows. So I was fortunate enough to start working in hospitals when I was 19 as a part-time respiratory therapist. And they gave me a bunch of training. So by age 20, and again, I was in undergrad training, I was working most weekends, night shift, doing things that only physicians can do now: cardiopulmonary resuscitation, putting down the breathing tube into the lungs, arterial blood gas punctures, etc. So almost every shift, there'd be one or more people who died. And I'm hands-on right there, sometimes little kids. And that drove me to my knees because, I had a kind of an unquestioned faith. God was all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, and that's true. However, I had a different understanding of what God was back then. So I thought, God would take care of things. And if that's the case, why are these little children dying? And sometimes after horrible suffering. So instead of going to medical school, I went to theology school and then got a master's in clinical psychology so I could share what I was learning through this period. I started doing yoga and meditation, which I've done for 50 years. Frankly, I experimented with some mind altering drugs. I guess I had the grace to not get addicted, but LSD and mushrooms and certainly pot and so on. But I saw, excuse me, I'll get over this. I saw pretty quickly that it wasn't a good long-term strategy. I did enough to allow me to really travel and expand my mind. But Ram Dass was a great teacher of mine back then, and he wrote that his teacher said about LSD, it'll help you glimpse heaven, but it won't let you stay there. And I read that, I said, okay, that's it, I'm done. And so that was just like a several-year period in my 20s. And since then, searching diligently, I became a doctor of chiropractic because I wanted to do holistic healthcare. At its philosophy, chiropractic is about healing body, mind, and spirit. So I did that for 35 years, at least part-time, directed a clinic. And then starting in 1997, in 95, I had a huge awakening. I was married, 2 kids, beautiful home, big practice, had everything you could want. And I was mowing the grass. We live on 5 acres. And all of a sudden, whammo, none of that mattered. And I had an intense calling to travel around the country and speak about holistic wellness and spiritual awakening. And I told my wife at the time, and she said, well, if you do that, I'm going to divorce you. I'm like, okay, but I did it part-time. And that's a real message to people, whatever you feel called to do. If you can't do it full-time, at least do it part-time. And so I traveled around the country on weekends and spoke to hundreds of Unity churches, primarily expos and so on. So then bring us into 2000, I started writing books, Soul Proof, and I had a radio show where I interviewed Michael Newton, who we'll be talking about today in our talk about pre-birth planning, Wayne Dyer, Brian Weiss, Raymond Moody. I mean, all the tops, and it was so cool. And so just that, I have 7 books, I have 10 audio products. I produced a documentary film called Soul Proof. I work a lot with helping parents heal. As you say, a lot of involvement with IANDS. I'm just recently became on the faculty of Humanities Team, which was started by Neil Donald Walsh and Steve Farrell. So just working, as we discussed before, now toward international level, that my goal is by 2035 to establish widespread peace and harmony, awakening, conscious living on our planet. And I think we're really close to doing that. And meeting you makes me think we're even closer than that.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Thanks for letting me get a little glimpse of you. And yeah, there's some parallels in our story. I mean, in like a bigger kind of vast way. I love you talking about the fact that you had this connection to back home, like back in heaven, just even as a child, and that your parents reminded you of this memory as you started to get older. And I think that that's really empowering. A lot of people, like for me, I had no spiritual awareness growing up. And then when I came into spiritual awareness in my adulthood, I was like, when do I get to go back home? When do I get to go back home? So when I hear people say like, oh, I've known that I'm not from here my whole life, and they have like happy, joyous lives, I'm like, okay, I can let go of the idea that I need to hurry up and get back there. Like heaven is here. Heaven's right now. Heaven's in this moment with each other. So I love that you brought that up. And yeah, we had talked a little bit about what we wanted to maybe discuss, and you've got a lot of information on pre-birth planning. You've interviewed like all the heavy hitters. You're saying all these names. I'm like, wow, that's like the dream team of people to be involved with. And so, yeah, maybe we can get into a little bit of dialogue about pre-birth planning. Can you explain to people what this concept is if they've never heard of it?
Sure. It's the idea, and there's, I'm sorry, there is some good evidence behind it that before souls, we'll use that word, but you could use consciousness, awareness, before your life force comes to Earth, that there's some planning involved. I mean, it makes total sense. You know, one thing we've learned from, I've been working with the SoulPhone Project for 7 years, is that the quote afterlife is not so different from the earthly life. You know, a lot of the same principles so apply. So if we're going to take a big trip on Earth, we're planning a trip to Arizona next month. Well, we do planning, and so same way. Why wouldn't I'll just use the word soul when they're coming to Earth plan? So it's not, these plans are not set in stone, because that would be determinism. There's always free will. However, the potentials, the possibilities, the likelihoods, those are the key words, are set up. And for people who want to learn more about this, they can see my article number 25, free article at soulproof.com. And it was one of the most difficult articles I've ever written. I have 122 of them now on that website. I consulted people like Bill Guggenheim and Suzanne Giesemann and Gary Schwartz and others, and found out people are all over the place on this topic. And especially when it comes to is their pre-birth planning for things like suicide and people who are murdered and so on. So it's a lengthy article, but it takes that to cover. It's a very deep subject. So the evidence I mentioned that something like this really exists is fourfold. First of all, from near-death experiences. I asked Eben Alexander and Raymond Moody at one of the conferences and talked to them, and they said, yeah, their understanding was that there was some planning, and these are people who report this, they say, especially those who went into the primordial light, the second level of the light. Understood that, yeah, there are plans made. However, you know, sometimes those plans don't work out. The second group of evidence comes from evidential mediums. These are mediums that are really sharp, have been evaluated and found to have valid abilities, and they report that there was planning involved. So when they're bringing through a what we call post-material person, the person that's passed on, that person will say to the sitter on Earth, you know, it was part of the plan, it's part of the design, the timing and method of how they passed on, and that of course gives peace. The next level of evidence is philosophical or common sense. One of the reasons I attended theology school was to find out for myself the real answer behind some of the obvious discrepancies of religion, like, well, it's God's will. And especially when children die, you know, children's bodies die, some well-intentioned ministers will say, well, it was God's will. And I'm like, well, that is so much crap. You know, that doesn't serve anyone. So really, God's a dictator who unilaterally directs things. Some people have a wonderful life, some people have a horrible life. It doesn't make sense theologically, philosophically, anyway. So the fact that we have choice, and hopefully we make these plans with our team, angels, guides, master teachers, and the light, that makes a lot of sense. Free will, you know, it's not all forced on us by a big guy in the sky. But the biggest evidence I've seen for pre-birth planning comes from the amazing work of Dr. Michael Newton, PhD in psychology, who founded the field of life between lives therapy. As I mentioned, I got to interview him in 2000. He passed, I think, about 5 years ago. It's really incredible. He discovered that, you know, he's just doing regression, meaning taking a person back in this lifetime to find the source of depression or chronic pain. And then people would get to where they were babies and then, boom, slip back into the time before they came to Earth. And he was surprised he actually collected data on that for 15 years before he shared it with anyone, had thousands of cases, which is really a diligent researcher. And I've had the pleasure, I know a number of people who are trained therapists by him. Ann Clark, for example, who is a former research director. She's an RN and a PhD. And these are really top shelf people. So these numbers may be off a little, but I think as of 2 years ago, they had 60,000 cases from people in 28 different countries. And the real impact of this information is how similar the reports are by all these different people from all these around the world, and how they are explaining how life between lives are set up. What I mentioned about beginner, intermediate, advanced souls, the colors of these souls that indicate. And it's fascinating. I have all of his books. I've read most of them 4 times, which I never do. But it's just, as you say, in a way, it reminds you of home. It helps you see the big picture of life. This information is especially helpful when I work with grieving parents, which I do a lot, because of course, so many of them will feel guilt or blame, and some of them have precognitions that something's going to happen to their child, but they don't act on it, and then their child's body is killed in a car wreck. Or, they felt like they could have done more when the child chose suicide, etc. But when they know there's some sort of pre-birth planning involved, it's like, oh, okay, it takes off some of the pressure and guilt and helps them heal and transform now.
Wow. Yeah. What you just said so much. And I love hearing this information from a scientific point of view. Like this is a very deep knowing for me because it was part of my spiritual experience. But if it wasn't, and I just happened upon this information, I would adopt this as part of my belief system because this is a belief that gives me immense freedom in my human experience, and it gives me autonomy. And I think that this information can be really useful for people who are dealing with grief or discomfort or trauma, instead of having that victim mentality take over, which I think is one of the ego's main goals, is to keep us in that victim mindset. Now it's like, oh, I'm actually a divine co-creator of my experience. Things don't happen to me anymore. They happen for me because on some soul level, I've chosen it for the evolvement of myself. And, it's very challenging to explain why a loss of a child would evolve you as a spirit, because our human minds are not capable of understanding something like that. So I love hearing it from like an evidential point of view, because again, it just like solidifies this for me, especially since we're having a conversation, but for anybody else who's interested in this. And I also love how you said that these pre-birth plans are not rigid, they're not set in stone, and it's really about probability and likelihood that something will happen. What's your personal opinion on like how many options are there for likelihood? Do you think that it's infinite? Do you think there's like 4 top plans? Any insight on that?
Well, first of all, I love hearing you talk. You have such a grasp of this. I'm guessing you're an advanced soul the way you just like, blah, 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 you understand all this. Um, and just to be clear, what I'm sharing, we don't have scientific evidence yet. What we're sharing is clinical and experiential evidence. And that's really important, because if we're going to go mainstream with what we call soul science, we need to have real clear communication. So recently, Dr. Gary Schwartz and I work closely together. He's former Harvard and Yale professor, now senior professor at the University of Arizona, and he directs the SoulPhone Project at the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. And you can learn more about the SoulPhone Project at soulphone.com. But Dr. Schwartz recently, we're getting really close to the soul switch, and that's another whole topic. which will allow binary responses from post-material persons, yes or no. And then that's a device will be needed for the soul keyboard, which will allow texting and typing with those who have changed worlds. But Dr. Schwartz said once we get this demonstration soul switch, and we hope to demonstrate it this summer, he wants to play and look at clinical topics like pre-birth planning and do scientific research on it, which means you need to have double-blinded controlled studies, replicated multi-center studies. So there is scientific proof or investigation, at least, coming forward on this. So to answer your question about the number, yeah, probably infinite, because you look at all the permutations. In other words, almost every moment, if you go to the right instead of the left, I mean, I spent a little time looking back and like, gosh, what if I hadn't done this? Or what if I would have done that? It can change everything. And that leads us to the topic of multilocation. And I discussed that also in an article at soulproof.com. So there are theoretical physicists like David Deutsch from Oxford and others who consider that, yes, there are an infinite number of experiences, spin-offs. Every time we come to the fork of the road, part of our energy explores one, and then part of the energy explores the other. Michael Newton, for example, in his work said that on average, people only need 25% of their total energy to have an earthly experience. And so the rest of that energy is exploring life for Creator, reporting back so that things can continue to improve and grow. And perhaps part of it never left home. That's one source of hope for these parents. For example, I said, I know this is really tough for you right now, but there's a very good chance that you and your child are in reality just as real as this together right now in another time, space, slice of life. Edgar Casey, for example, had information that on average, a person will have about 10 exit points for when they leave this realm. And for example, I just interviewed a mom the other night who said her son fell and bashed his head open horribly and was 16 months old, and the doctors didn't expect him to live. Well, he did, and then at 24, passed on. So she said if he would have died, because he's only a child her whole life, she said if he would have died when he was 16 months old, she was quite sure she would have chosen suicide. So perhaps his soul, their primary soulmates, we can talk about that definition, but perhaps his soul decided not to leave at 16 months, which is one of his possible exit points, because he knew what it'd do to his mom.
Wow. Yeah, we could go down a million rabbit holes with this information, right? Because it's
Yeah, a lot of
so
fun.
layered. There's so many, I just like picture all these tubes, like just the same way that like the soul can go and check out all these different things. Having this conversation can also take us in all these different directions. Yeah, I would love if maybe we could talk a little bit about your own information around your own personal pre-birth plan. You said that you've done some regressions. Obviously, you've talked to all these top dogs and this line of spirituality and spiritual awareness. So would you mind sharing some of the insight that you have around your own pre-life plan?
No, not at all. I'm an open book. I actually created a pre-birth planning audio. I mentioned I created 10 of these. So this is done under very deep relaxation, which is also hypnosis and guided imagery, because we know from all these different sources pretty much how it works. So people can visit soulproof.com/shop and buy that audio. It's only $15. I price it so people around the world can afford it. However, if people can't truly afford that, email me, mark@soulproof.com, and I'll send you a free digital link. I mean, that's how much I'm in this for the money. But we know that there is a place of pre-birth planning. Some people describe it as like being on the control deck of Starship Enterprise, with all these computers and controls, and they're looking at different scenarios. Other people describe it as being in a sacred nature place, being surrounded by angels and guides. That's what came up for me. And I've done this a number of times and looked at different big turning points in my life. And did I indeed plan that? And if so, why? So in the planning, I am in a special power spot, the ocean in front of me, the desert to one side, the forest behind me, and right behind me, mountains. And I'm pretty sure all that doesn't exist all together, maybe California. But it's really a beautiful place to sit, again, surrounded by my team, and get in touch with this. So it's so far out, yeah. And this is why, I've been around a few Hindu gurus, and they will giggle a lot. They will spend a lot of time just giggling. And at first I'm like, are these guys part bonkers? And then I realized they are seeing so much of the universe, the cosmos, that they realize just how hilarious it is what humans go through. Descartes, I believe, or Pascal said, God is like a comedian playing to an audience that's too afraid to laugh. And so it's really true when we can see more and more of the big picture. Well, that's what we can see as souls when we don't have this obstructive view of life that we do now with this limited human brain. So the information is that souls can even try on different times and places, and so they will come to visit. And this earth for a short period of time. Okay, do I want to live in this city? So they will pop into a city. They're not really fully formed like we are, but they can be for a while. And this helps explain, so many people have been like, I saw somebody out of the corner of my eye and I turned and they weren't there anymore. Or somebody popped into my life for a while, but then they just disappeared. And I find all this fascinating. So people can try on parents, they'll come be in the home where the mom and dad who want to have a kid someday, and they'll say, okay, are these people I want to choose for my parents? Is this a good match for the city, and so on? And then after all that investigation, again, hopefully, ideally, with working with your team, they will make a decision as to where to enter for the earthly experience. By the way, Betty, this helps explain some people who spin out of control, because beginner souls can make impulsive decisions. I can do anything, just give me whatever body and brain you want. Give me the worst parents, let me grow up in a sewer. It doesn't matter. I can handle it. I got this. And then they get here and they're like, oh shit, I should have thought that through a little more. And then they numb out, with alcohol and drugs. They try to mask the pain, or they have a mismatched brain. You have the brain that has a propensity toward biochemical imbalance, serious mental illness. And these are people then that can become murderers, choose suicide, addicts, all sorts of things, abusive people. And I, as a human, can understand how that could go wrong, poor planning, poor follow through, poor choices, or they were abused, that things happened to them. So certainly the higher realms understand that. So that helps us look at people who seem evil. Hitler, for example, he was abused as a child. So how much how much abuse can a person take before they become an abuser. So it really helps us look at, it's not the devil causing this, it's imbalanced, twisted people who need compassion and love and higher treatment, not condemning them to hell.
Whoa. That was like such a hit for me with, yeah, that just like closed a couple of loops. But I love that. I've never conceptualized this before, thinking about the poor planning of a beginner. So, I mean, honestly, I think that probably even advanced souls, sometimes I wonder, like, was this actually an informed decision? Now, I know that transformation is possible. I truly believe it's inevitable. And that can take place within any living conscious being's earthly experience. But sometimes I think, like when we're home, we don't really remember what it's like to experience 70 years of life, because when we go back to this pre-birth planning space, when we go back to eternity, this is a dream. And it's literally like waking up from a night of sleep where you wake up and you're like, damn, that was weird. And then you can't even remember what happened. So then you do it all over again. And is it informed? Because you're like, oh, well, I'm going to take on all these experiences, and you don't realize like, oh, okay, I don't know what it's going to be like to be an addict for 25 years. I can't comprehend what 25 years is because I'm in a timeless space. So sometimes I wonder, I've gone back and forth, like, is this an informed decision? Is it not? But I love how you said beginner souls can be impulsive. And I think that the idea of coming to Earth, and you hear so many people say, like, Earth is the most exciting place to be. It's the most challenging school. I've heard so many people say this is the Ivy League of spiritual schools. And then I'm like, is it? Or is it actually like the high school for bad kids and pregnant teenagers? Like, is it really? But I love the idea of thinking that sometimes we take on too much. And I love the idea of that could create an imbalance in the chemical makeup, because I've never conceptualized that before. And it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, you and I are on the same wavelength. I'll just respond to four things you just brought up, about it seems like a dream. I mentioned the teacher Ram Dass. Um, he said, how you'll have a really vivid dream and it seems so real, but then you wake up. He said, wait till you wake up from this one, which is really good. You talked about evolved soul. Well, I'll use this one last. You talked about, yeah, how souls who know they are eternal beings, who know they are one with the one, who know that these sorts of earthly experiences are a blink of an eye in the span of eternity, that only require a portion of their consciousness, will indeed want to experience everything. The old saying, never judge a person till you've walked a mile in their moccasins. Well, okay, so these more evolved souls will say, okay, I'm going to be an addict. I'm going to be, a murderer. I'm going to be everything. And then I will have more compassion and will be able to work with these people because I've been there. And so that's really profound. You mentioned Earth being a sublime place and so on. When I trained with Brian Weiss 25 years ago to do past life regressions, he said that based on all his experiences, he considered Earth to be the toilet bowl of the cosmos. And I'm like, yeah, I can believe that. And then finally, a fourth point you brought up, that even more evolved souls can make poor choices, and I really consider my fiance Andy as a really, really evolved person. I think she's part angel, and we know that people on Earth can be hybrids, but we consider that learning to listen to and follow our inner voice could be one of the primary reasons why we took on this earthly experience. It's such an important topic, and I just wrote an article on that, of course. I think it's article 121, listening to your inner voice. And so I'll just give you a quick example. When I was 20 years old, my first love, Rita, broke up with me. We'd gone together 4 years, which is a long time, when you're 20. And I thought we were going to spend a long weekend together, and she canceled it, and I knew she was starting to break up. So here I am in my dorm. Everybody else had left Memorial Day weekend, 2 weeks before finals. And so I was really sad and hurting and all. And so I had been around pot a little bit, tried it a couple of times, really didn't care for it. But I decided, okay, I'm in so much pain, I'm just going to get stoned. So I went to this guy I knew who sold a little bit. His name was Bill. And I wanted to buy a nickel bag. That was a quarter of an ounce for $5 back then. Yeah, 1974. And he said, Mark, no, not you. You're one of my models. You're one of my idols. Come on, don't do this. Now, looking back, I was like, shouldn't that have been a sign when a drug dealer tries to talk you out of buying? But I was like, no, I want it. And so I remember standing in front, I put it in my sock drawer, which I thought was a really great place to hide it. And because that was pretty serious offense back then. And I stood there, I was looking out the window, and there was this voice said, come on, Mark, don't do this. Go talk to a counselor, go work out, or, go walk in the park, do anything positive. And it was just kind of like pleading at me, my inner voice. But I said, no, I'm going to do this. So I rolled a joint and started smoking. And that, by the way, delayed my mourning, dealing with that grief by many years. So it was a really bad fork in the road. However, it led to experiences and so on that I wouldn't have had I, dealt with it straight on. So yeah, at some point you have a peace about it. You can honor your past, you can have gratitude for it, you can make a commitment to bless others, and at the same time say in the future, I'm gonna choose the really high way, which is doing it consciously.
Wow, I love that. Thank you for that story. That's incredible. And I love that so much. Because it does the timelines fracture. It's not like as intense as like, oh my goodness, every decision I make is creating this alternate reality where who knows what's happening, whether I catch the subway or I don't catch the subway. But I think that there are pivotal moments where I love what you said, like you ignored the pain, you pushed it away, you sedated it with something. And so then it created a whole nother kind of ripple of experience for you to have. And then you had to, of course, we still have to deal with the pain no matter how long we run away from it. And now in our collective, there's so many other ways to run away from pain. It doesn't have to be something as tangible as drinking or using drugs. It could be scrolling on your phone for 5 hours or, making poor choices with food or diet or exercise and all of these things. There's so many ways to avoid feeling your feelings.
Two more things. I know we need to wrap here, but you mentioned all the different paths that can occur, and whichever way you choose, that creates others. There's a wonderful film called The Curious Life of Benjamin Buttons. Brad Pitt starred in it, and some people get him and I mixed up. Pitstick, and but they have a wonderful scene in there where his beloved Daisy injures her ankle, and all the things that affected that. If this happened, if this wouldn't have happened. So I encourage people to see that. The other thing is that you mentioned all the possibilities and all the alternate realities. And I think for some people that can just get overwhelming, like, well, what do I do? It's too complex. And I think that's why Jesus and other great teachers really condensed it down for us. And sometimes you have to read between the lines in sacred text to see what really was said by these enlightened ones versus what our sources have had over the millennia. But just basic things, love one another, love yourself, forgive each other, let your light shine, don't hide it under a bushel. Know that you are one with the Father, with the source. Know that life does not end here. Do your best, run a good race, fight the good fight. Those are just the basics. If you cover those, you'll be able to navigate through the experiences and don't get too caught up with the infinite number of possibilities.
I love, yes, thank you. Stay grounded. Stay here on earth for a little while. Just like
Exactly.
stay
Yeah,
here.
walk in the woods.
Yes. There was one other thing that I just want to see if maybe we can touch on for a minute. And you said something about like soulmates. You were talking about a mother and a son being soulmates with each other. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of conception, can a soulmate be reincarnated into a person's life in the same lifetime? So let's say like a mother did lose a child. Could that child come back as a form of another soulmate or another relationship in the same lifetime?
Yeah, great question, Betty. First of all, define the term. So again, Michael Newton, and I consider he's the guy on this topic. He said that we have on average 25 or so primary soulmates, people we're closest with, who we have been with throughout time and who help fill out our cast for this earth experience. It may be the mom, maybe the kid, and so on. Then a larger number of secondary soulmates who maybe fill out less important roles, cousins and so on. But these are generalizations. For some people, a cousin may be a primary soulmate. And then even more tertiary soulmates. So when I say soulmate, I don't mean there's just one. But to your question, can a child, for the soul of a child who's passed, for example, come back in the same lifetime? Yeah, there's some pretty good evidence that can happen. It's fairly rare. When I trained with Dr. Weiss, he said that on average, souls will reincarnate every 150 or 200 years because keep in mind, soul time and earth time are different. And those who have passed on have a lot of work to do, sometimes healing, recharging, then a lot of learning and so on before they go out and have another formed incarnation. However, there are, as I say, at least several that I know of. Bill Guggenheim talked about one in his book, Hello from Heaven, After Death Communication. And I've heard of some from the Helping Parents Heal Parents, where, yeah, there's pretty good evidence. For example, the parent will have a child who passes, say, at age 1, and then a few years later gets pregnant again. Now this new child is about 4, and the child just out of nowhere will say, when I was in your tummy before, um, I didn't feel good, and then I fell asleep, or not. When I was with you before, after I was in your tummy, I didn't feel good, and then I fell asleep, and then I went away for a while. And the mom will say, what did you just say? And the child will go, oh, what? And they'll turn back into a little kid. So yeah, there's some good evidence for that. But the bottom line, whether children or any loved ones come back, is that love and life are eternal. We are connected. You couldn't lose a loved one if you tried. And that this universe is just so beautifully set up. I'll wrap with one morning I woke up, it was one of those, what time is it? Um, but I realized that something really profound had been going on in my brain around. And so I wanted to catch it. So I closed my eyes again and pretended I was still asleep. And I caught it and I immediately wrote it down. It was this: this earthly experience is a totally safe, meaningful, and magnificent adventure amidst forever. So when you really get that, the more you get that, the more you're free, and that's what I think in the Bible for, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. And that's when you let your light shine, you're in the moment. And I know people, like they're dying. Gandhi, for example, he was shot 3 times in the abdomen. You know how much that hurts? And he just lay there repeating names of God, Ram, Ram, as he died. So yeah, that's when that's how you become a master. And that's what we're here for. And as we discussed, as more and more of us awaken to the nature of reality, then we can create heaven on earth and have a marvelous adventure while we're doing it, a good time.
Yes. Oh, wow. Yeah. I feel so lit up with spirit. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. So grateful for you. and your service to our community and everything that you're doing for the collective. I really, really enjoyed this space, and we'll see you next time.
My pleasure. Take care.